to our two members of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson and Mo Brooks, for being on the phone with us today. And thanks for all your comments, your phone calls, your tweets, and your Facebook messages. You have a great weekend.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered today by our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. God of the universe, we give you thanks for giving us another day. As the members of this people's house deliberate these days, give them the wisdom and magnanimity to lay aside what might divide us as a people, to forge a secure future for our country. We pray for all people who have special needs. May your presence be known to those who are sick, that they might feel the power of your healing spirit. Be with those who suffer persecution in so many places of our world, and bless our troops who are engaged in the easing of those sufferings. Give to all who are afraid or anxious, or whose minds are clouded by uncertain futures, the peace and confidence that come from trust in your goodness and mercy. We thank you again for the tremendous opportunity you have given the members of this House to serve their fellow citizens. Inspire them to be their best selves, and may they be, in turn, an inspiration to the nation and to the world. May all that is done here this day be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof, and pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Fleming.
Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will entertain up to 5 one-minute requests on each side. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this morning's announcement of the unemployment rate proves again the President's economic policies are failing American families. The unemployment rate has increased to a tragic 9.2%. The out-of-control borrowing and spending in Washington continues to kill small business job creation. It has been 1 year since the President declared an end to the recession and the beginning of the summer of recovery. The only way to describe the country's job numbers during that time is a failure of leadership. Private unemployment is now 1.8 million below the level from when the wasteful stimulus passed. Where are the jobs, Mr. President? This administration's policies are crippling our economy and killing job creation. The President's re-election campaign says the unemployment rate does not matter, but American families know better. The House Republicans' cut and grow plan is very simple. First cut spending, then the economy will grow. This is a practical solution to get Americans back to work. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
Time of the gentleman's expired. The gentleman from Ohio. Without objection, so ordered.
Congress is awakening to its constitutional obligations on matters of war and peace. In the past 2 months, we've sparked a great debate on war and on war powers, the implications of which will continue to be felt in this nation and around the world. Soon the war in Libya and the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq will go beyond foreign policy issues. They'll become domestic issues, financial security issues. As we continue to wage these wars, more and more Americans will become aware that this administration has decided that bombing bridges in other countries is more important than building bridges in America. With our present and new foreign adventures, America under this administration chooses war, not jobs and wealth building here in America, bombs, not books, financial instability, not social security, austerity, not prosperity. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about an administration that's demonstrating more of an interest in nation building abroad than in rebuilding America here at home. It has time to change, but will it?
Time of the gentleman's expired. The gentleman from Louisiana. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, Americans deserve to know the truth when it comes to the Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan's involvement in crafting a defense of Obamacare during her tenure as Solicitor General for President Obama. This is why I, along with 48 of my House colleagues, am calling for an investigation into the extent of Justice Kagan's involvement in defending Obamacare, and if it warrants her recusal from any and all Obamacare cases that may come before the High Court. It is imperative for Americans to have confidence in the impartiality of the Supreme Court. Americans have a legitimate right to know the truth about Elena Kagan's involvement in Obamacare. How can any reasonable person believe that she can be impartial when a case involving Obamacare comes before the High Court? Furthermore, the U.S. Code Section 455, Title 28 says she must recuse herself. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Minnesota. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to express my frustration that I feel at the continuing budget impasse in Minnesota. Minnesota faces the biggest budget deficit in its history, and with it comes a responsibility to govern and a cautionary tale for this body. A government shutdown at any level is not only detrimental to the economy and to the success of small business, but it's hazardous to the progress of our society as educational programs and nonprofit organizations are put at risk. Like many of the citizens of southern Minnesota who have written me about this shutdown, I share a concern for the families harmed by this shutdown. Working parents who receive child care assistance, disabled Minnesotans who rely on state services for their better quality of life, roads remaining unprepared, and simple things like campgrounds being closed where families can't spend time together. A gentleman approached me in Stewartville on the 4th of July parade. He asked me if I was working this week. I said yes I was, and he said he wasn't, but he sure wished he was because he was forced furloughed. When it comes to divided government, we all win when no one political party wins. In Minnesota, that means both the governor and the legislature needs to compromise. We need to put politics aside, put Minnesota first. The same applies to this body. I yield back.
Gentleman from Minnesota. Without objection, so ordered.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you can hardly turn on the television or the radio these days without hearing about our nation's debt crisis. And the reason we find ourselves in this crisis is not because Washington taxes, is because we tax too little. Rather, it's because Washington spends too much. Raising taxes on America's job creators, as some here in Washington suggest, is not the answer. It won't open closed factories, it won't stimulate the economy, and it won't put our friends and neighbors back to work. What we need, and what the American people are asking us to do, is to see that government lives within its means. Over the past few years, hardworking Americans across this country have tightened their belts and lived within their means and cut back on spending. And there's no reason that their government can't do the same thing. It's often been said that it's not in the federal government's nature to shrink, and I think here in Washington our colleagues should work to prove them wrong by ending wasteful Washington spending as a way to address our nation's budget deficit. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to draw people's attention to one of the great, nice spots of what's happening in the world today. There aren't many. We're going to hear about every one of them this morning. But there's at least one happening right now in Africa. Tomorrow we will welcome the newest nation to the community of nations in South Sudan. This is a country that most of us probably never heard of. I certainly didn't until a few years ago, and I heard about it because of some of the atrocities that were happening there. Southern Sudan is a country that's born out of 20 years of internal civil war. 20 years. not from outside forces like this country likes to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. They did it themselves, on their own. And I just want to stand up here today and tell them congratulations, to welcome them to the community of nations, and to tell them that I, for one, and I believe this House, will stand with them as they struggle to make sure that their new democracy is successful. They have a lot of threats on every border. They have a lot of internal issues. They're an incredibly poor country with a lot of challenges. But as the greatest democracy in the history of the world, we have an obligation to stand with them as they build their new democracy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, the people of South Sudan have endured 2 decades of wanton violence, rape, torture, and hunger systematically imposed upon them by the Bashir dictatorship in Khartoum. More than 2 million people were killed, 4 million people displaced, and countless families decimated. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005 ended the war and put South Sudan on the path to nationhood. Tomorrow, when the people of South Sudan emerge as the newest nation on earth, tomorrow when that dream is realized, Americans will join the people of South Sudan in celebrating this extraordinary, hope-filled event. Yet recently, at least 100,000 Sudanese have been displaced from the Abyei area, and tens of thousands of Southerners living in South Kordofan State have been recently forced from their homes, some of them murdered. So there are serious remaining challenges. Nevertheless, we hope and we pray that the people of South Sudan will finally live in peace, respect for their basic human rights, and freedom. Yield back the balance.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Colorado.
Permission to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to discuss H.R. 268. America has not had a more pro-Israel president than President Obama. The president has unwaveringly supported Israel's right to self-defense, ensured Israel's military edge, protected her citizens through the Iron Dome, and worked to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. The president also understands, as we all do, that essential to Israel's security, America's security, and Palestinian security is a negotiated resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, creating a lasting peace. The President's call for a negotiated resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the pro-Israel position that's absolutely essential to ensuring our allies' future as a democratic homeland of the Jewish people. We should also take an opportunity to be honest about what the President did and didn't propose. The President did not say that Israel should be forced to return to her 1967 borders. The President did say that the borders of Israel and a Palestinian state should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps, a concept which has been considered a given in all the serious discussions of a two-state solution in the last decade. While fostering divisions serves the political interests of some, it's not in the long-term interests of Israel, Palestine, or the United States. I yield back the balance of my time.
His time has expired. The gentlelady from Michigan.
House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, for the last 2.5 years, President Obama and his allies in Congress here have been spending on a spending spree which has led to annual deficits of $1.4 trillion and a national debt that now exceeds $14 trillion. The Republicans have drawn a line in the sand and said enough. We've changed the culture here in Washington from how much more are we going to spend to how much are we going to cut. We've passed a responsible budget which focuses on getting economic growth going and on new jobs, a budget that would put us on the path to prosperity and also to fiscal sanity. And today's anemic jobs report, with unemployment rising again now to 9.2%, shows that we have so much more to do, and the idea of job-killing tax increases is absolutely a non-starter. I'm proud that our Republican negotiators that have been in negotiations with the President and the Democratic leadership are standing strong over increasing the debt limit with a strong focus on jobs. And I hope that the President and the Democrats will finally join us in getting our fiscal house in order. And for the sake of the American people, Mr. Speaker, let's get the job done.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Minnesota.
Address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, yes, June jobs report is not encouraging. 18,000 jobs added. But I cannot ever forget that it was January 2009 when we lost 741,000 jobs the last month of the Bush presidency. Under President Obama, we have added jobs, and of course we have not added enough, but they have been adding. But the American people should know that we need about 150,000 jobs a month in order to push the unemployment rate down. Because we added jobs but not enough, the unemployment rate has gone up. But the most important thing for the American people to know, that the Republican promise to make jobs the first agenda during the election has not been fulfilled. They have yet to introduce or pass through this House one single jobs bill, not one. All they've done is cut jobs, mostly by going after public employees. And this is what the American people need to bear in mind as they think about who is on their side.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Morning, Mr. Speaker. By the direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 340 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 51, House Resolution 340. Resolved, that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 1309, to extend the authorization of the National Flood Insurance Program to achieve reforms to improve the financial integrity and stability of the program, and to increase the role of private markets in the management of flood insurance risk and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. Section 2A. It shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Financial Services now printed in the bill. The committee amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. All points of order against the committee amendment in the nature of the substitute are waived. B. No amendment to the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution and amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of this resolution. C. Each amendment printed in the report of the Committee on Rules shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. D. All points of order against amendments printed in the report of the Committee on Rules or amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of this resolution are waived. Section 3. It shall be in order at any time for the Chair of the Committee on Financial Services or his designee to offer amendments en bloc consisting of amendments printed in the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution, not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc offered pursuant to this section shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the Chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. The original proponent of an amendment included in such amendments en bloc may insert a statement in the congressional record immediately before the disposition of the amendments en bloc. Section 4. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill to the House with such amendments as may have been adopted. Any member may demand a separate vote in the House on any amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole to the bill or to the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman, my colleague and friend from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, pending which I yield myself such time as I may.
Gentleman's recognized.
During consideration of this resolution, all time is yielded for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks. House Resolution 340 provides for a structured rule designed and designated by the Rules Committee for consideration of H.R.
1309. This rule allows for 25 amendments submitted to the Rules Committee by Democrats and Republicans to be made in order. I rise today in support of this rule, Mr. Speaker. This legislation was introduced by the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Insurance, Housing, and Community Opportunity, Mrs. Biggert, the gentlewoman from Illinois, and this bill has gone through regular order. There were hearings on this issue. H.R. 1309 was marked up in Financial Services Committee and reported out by unanimous vote of 54-0, and the chairman of the Rules Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreyer, provided a structured amendment process with 25 additional amendments to be considered on the House floor. Said another way, Mr. Speaker, the Rules Committee, under the leadership of David Dreyer, is willing to have in our upstairs committee room members of Congress come and testify with the understanding that their confidence in the process of this House of Representatives, that they can bring forth their amendments, be heard by a Rules Committee that can equally give Republican and Democrat side the ideas that those members wish to bring before this body, and that is what is happening with 25 amendments being made in order by the gentleman from California with the Rules Committee. Today, I will discuss the background of the current National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, and why a long-term reauthorization is important, what the underlying legislation does to the NFIP, and why reforms are necessary. The NFIP was created in 1968 to address the nation's flood exposure and the need to alleviate taxpayers' responsibility for flood losses paid out in the form of post-disaster relief following annual flooding that occurs across this country. In 1973, the Flood Disaster Protection Act established a mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement for structures located in identified special flood hazard areas. By 1994, Congress required lenders to purchase coverage on behalf of and to bill premiums to mortgagees who failed to purchase coverage on their own. The 2005 hurricane season resulted in significant claims which the NFIP annual contributions could not cover. So, the NFIP borrowing authority, which was at $1.5 billion a year, was increased 3 times from 2005, 2006, and 2007, allowing the NFIP to borrow up to $20.8 billion. Currently, the NFIP owes the National Treasury $17.75 billion. A recent Insurance Journal article from March 8, 2011, discusses this plan, and it stated, and I quote, "The proposals do not attempt to put the program on sounder financial footing by insisting that current subsidized prices to most policies be raised so they eventually cover the actual cost of risk determined by the actuarials," end of quote. The underlying bill allows for greater accountability so taxpayers, meaning the federal government, actually incur less risk than in current NFIP. Limiting the exposures for the taxpayer is one piece part of what this bill does. The legislation we're discussing today reauthorizes the NFIP for 5 years through September 30th, 2016. The current program is scheduled to expire on September 30th of this year. The last time Congress passed a long-term flood insurance program was in 2004. Since its expiration in 2008, the NFIP has been extended 11 times and lapsed 3 times during that period. These short-term extensions and lapses create needless uncertainty in the marketplace in an already struggling residential and commercial real estate market all across the United States. Charles Symington, with the Independent Insurance Agents and Brokers of America, was quoted in a recent industry insurance journal stating that, and I quote, "The 5-year extension of NFIP after several years of short lapses and last-minute renewals is critical
because it gives the marketplace certainty." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, I believe Charles is correct. The Congress of the United States must do its job by looking at those programs, looking at their need to make sure that they work properly and to make sure the exposure to the taxpayer is not overextended. Charles Symington has this correct. In addition to providing a much-needed long-term reauthorization, this bill extends to the NFIP to ensure the immediate and near-term physical and administrative health of the program. The bill also ensures the NFIP's continued viability by encouraging broader participation in this program, increasing financial accountability, eliminating unnecessary rate subsidies, and updating the program to the needs that currently face this great nation. Since 2006, the NFIP has been cited by the Government Accounting Office, or GAO, as a high-risk government program. This means that embedded within this program, it is not being run to the best benefit of not just its mission statement, but also in the best interest of the taxpayer. The GAO has found that the NFIP does not charge sufficiently high rates to cover its claims obligations and projected future losses, resulting in significant federal expenditures and potentially large liabilities on top of the $17.75 billion that the program is already in debt to. 2, protect the American taxpayer from future risk of federal programs already in debt. The NFIP must be reformed, and that's why we're here today. The underlying bill provides for some of the necessary reforms, and certainly we don't have to debate this, but with a $14 trillion deficit and out-of-control, wasteful Washington government spending, Congress must provide the necessary oversight and accountability to ensure less taxpayer risk. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on this rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Texas for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is one of those rare occasions where the gentleman from Texas and I actually agree on something. I think the underlying bill is a good bill, and I look forward to supporting it. And while this rule is not an open rule, and I don't think that we've had an open rule on an authorizing bill since this Congress began, the gentleman is such a good guy, I'm not going to make a big deal of that. There's 25 of the 30 amendments that were offered and made in order, and so I think we will have a good debate. The rule before us today provides for the reauthorization of the National Flood Insurance Program through September 30th, 2016. This program was established in 1968 in response to increasing federal government spending for disaster relief. The NFIP was intended to alleviate some of the public's financial burden because the government covered losses generated by floods in the form of disaster relief payments. With the increase of severe weather in the past few years, the need to reauthorize this program before it expires on September 30th is great. The National Flood Insurance Program, housed within the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has become financially strained following severe hurricanes, including Katrina in 2005, which significantly increased insurance claims. In addition to extending this bill for an additional 5 years, this bill also includes a 3-year delay of mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement as a result of the new updated flood maps. This will allow our constituents to be notified if their home is now at risk of flooding and purchase insurance accordingly by requiring annual notifications to homeowners living in flood zones about the flood risk in their community, the geographical boundaries of the flood zone, the requirement to purchase flood insurance, and a general estimate of what similar homeowners in similar communities typically pay for flood insurance. This bill also provides optional coverage for additional living expenses incurred by homeowners when losses from a flood make their home unfit to live in. For businesses and commercial properties or multifamily properties, this bill provides optional coverage for losses resulting from any partial or total interruption of the insured's business caused by flood. Mr. Speaker, we saw massive devastation to the southeastern part of our country in 2005, but we also saw the resiliency of the American people. It's no easy task to rebuild your entire life from ground up. recognizing the economic reality that having flood coverage could keep families from financial ruin, but at the same time add additional and substantial costs to family budgets. This bill allows families to pay flood insurance premiums in installments. This bill would also help our local communities prepare for the worst by authorizing the use of community development block grant funds for communities to reach out to homeowners about flood insurance rates, mapping, and inclusion in flood zones, and by authorizing localities to use community development block grant funds to supplement existing state or local funding for building code enforcement. The National Flood Insurance Reform Act gives communities the tools they need to prepare, protect, and to rebuild. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the Rules Committee made an order my amendment to H.R. 1309, and I'd like to thank the committee for working with me to make this important amendment in order. My amendment is simple. If FEMA makes a mistake in designing a flood map, communities can be reimbursed for the costs of mounting a successful challenge. Currently, communities that dispute FEMA's flood elevations can hire a private engineering firm to get a second opinion flood map. While this may sound like an attractive option, it puts a lot of the smaller communities in a very difficult financial position. Hiring a private engineering firm is expensive and cost prohibitive for many small communities. On the one hand, if the community decides that it's too expensive to get a second opinion, homeowners are forced to pay higher or in some cases needless flood insurance premiums. On the other hand, if the community does mount a successful challenge to the original FEMA map, homeowners are spared from having to pay the higher flood insurance premiums, but the town still must pay the costs associated with obtaining that second map. Now, I've heard from many small communities that are forced into this tough situation, including the town of Holliston, Massachusetts, which is in my district. There is substantial evidence to support the argument that the FEMA map is incorrect, but town officials are struggling to find a way to pay the $30,000 it would cost to conduct a second engineering study. I feel for these town officials. They want to do the right thing and help their residents, but these small towns are already cash-strapped and cutting funding left and right for essential services like schools and police and firefighters, not to mention infrastructure. There simply is no money for a legitimate but expensive second opinion map. If FEMA makes a mistake in mapping a flood area, then they should pay for it, and I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment. Mr. Speaker, this bill is proof that Congress can work in a bipartisan way. Passed out of the House Committee on Financial Services 54-0, this bipartisan bill is timely with hurricane season just around the corner. It is also important to add that the Congressional Budget Office estimates enacting H.R. 1309 will have no net impact on direct spending over the 2012 to 16 or 2012 to 2021 periods. I want to commend my colleague from Illinois, Mrs. Biggert, for her leadership on this and for working in a bipartisan way and producing what I think is a good bill. I look forward to working with her to make sure that this is passed. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to have a very valuable part of our Republican team today, a gentlewoman who has taken hundreds of meetings and who led the way what I believe was to better the circumstance with the flood insurance program. She is from the Financial Services Committee. She's the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Insurance, Housing, and Community Affairs. And I would yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman, Mrs. Biggert.
Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the rule for H.R. 1309, the Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2011. I'd like to thank Mr. Sessions for introducing and managing this bill, and Rule Committee Chairman Dreyer and the leadership for scheduling floor time. On May 13th, the Financial Services Committee favorably reported, as been said, the Flood Insurance Reform Act by a unanimous vote of 54 to nothing. This bill is important and reflects the hard work and bipartisan support of the Financial Services Committee. It would reauthorize for 5 years the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, and enact a series of reforms designed to improve NFIP's financial stability, reduce the burden on taxpayers, and explore ways to increase private market participation. To improve NFIP's financial stability, the bill phases in actuarially sound rates for policyholders. In doing so, it will help to shore up NFIP and allow it to pay down its $17.75 billion debt to the taxpayer. It also increases the minimum deductibles for properties, while at the same time gives homeowners more flexibility in how they can pay for their flood insurance. According to CBO, the combined effect of these and other changes would bring an additional $4.2 billion of net income to NFIP over the next 10 years. Perhaps most importantly, H.R. 1309 eliminates a barrier to the development of a private flood insurance market and puts us on a path towards a long-term plan for flood insurance that eliminates taxpayer risk. First, it requires lenders to accept non-NFIP-backed flood insurance coverage provided by a private entity if that coverage meets all the same requirements as NFIP-backed flood insurance. And second, FEMA is required to solicit bids from the private sector and report to Congress on the cost to the private sector, not to taxpayer, of bearing the risk of flood insurance. Finally, the bill addresses many of the concerns that members have raised with us about new maps, especially as they relate to dam and levee decertifications. This bill allows newly mapped communities facing higher rates to annually and up to 3 years to request that FEMA suspend the requirement to purchase flood insurance while they work to construct or fix their flood protection systems. With the NFIP's authorization set to expire on September 30th, it is critical that the House act to pass this bill as soon as possible. Doing so will give the House and Senate time to begin a dialogue and shape a common-sense reform measure. In short, we fully intend to avoid a recurrence of what happened last Congress when the program lapsed, causing turmoil in a recovering housing market, and was simply extended without reforms. Congress cannot continue to kick the can down the road. With that, again, I thank Mr. Sessions and the members of the Rules Committee. I'd also like to thank all the members from both sides of the aisle that helped to craft this bill. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Financial Services Committee for their work on this bill, especially Ms. Waters, Ms. Capito, Mr. Garrett, Mr. Dole, and Mr. Stivers, who are original co-sponsors of this bipartisan bill. I urge my colleagues to support the rule for H.R. 1309 and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, a great leader on this issue, Ms. Matsui.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1309, the National Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2011. A full 5-year reauthorization of the program is critically important for our nation. I want to thank and commend Chairwoman Biggert and Ranking Member Waters for their leadership on this issue. Ushering in a 5-year reauthorization will provide welcome relief for those who live in our country's floodplains. I thank Chairwoman Biggert for including language from my own H.R. 902, legislation that will modernize FEMA's flood zone designations. Specifically, it would update current law to take local, state, and federal funding into account when determining flood zone designations. H.R. 1309 would extend the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, for 5 years and allow property owners in participating communities to purchase protection against flooding. As we have seen across our country this year and in recent years, the NFIP is critically important to so many Americans. When a flood disaster strikes, the homeowners that have flood insurance can at least see their way through the crisis. The NFIP offers the victims of floods the ability to make their lives whole again. Of course, the best insurance against a flood is a strong flood protection system. In my hometown of Sacramento, California, residents have taxed themselves hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for stronger flood protection. On one project, in the Natomas Basin alone, state and local governments will have spent more than $300 million over the last 5 years on levee improvements. This has all been invested, I must point out, without acknowledgement by FEMA or funding from the Corps of Engineers. I'm working tirelessly to change that and ensure that the federal government follows through with their commitment to this project. There is no doubt that the Natomas Basin, like most of Sacramento, is at risk of flooding, as it lays at the confluence of two great rivers. We know we must continue to build up our levees as well as carry flood insurance. Fortunately, the Sacramento region is working with the Army Corps of Engineers and the California Department of Water Resources to implement an aggressive levee improvement plan to achieve a 200-year level of flood protection. While these efforts are ongoing, flood insurance has become mandatory for many homeowners, insurance that can cost more than $1,350 annually. That is nearly 4 times the PRP rate. The increasing cost of flood insurance, which is on top of the annual flood protection assessments that my constituents are already paying, compounds their financial burden. For these reasons, I believe that it is reasonable to phase in higher rates over a 5-year period. I have an amendment that I will offer during debate on the underlying bill that will phase in the full cost of flood insurance policies in a more equitable way moving forward. I believe that this is a necessity that will assist homeowners in these trying economic times. I look forward to its being included in the overall reauthorization. This approach would encourage responsible homeowners across the country to continue paying into NFIP without adding risk to either the floodplain or the NFIP. Again, I thank Chairwoman Biggert and Ranking Member Waters for their leadership on this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Back to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, the beautiful part about the Republican Party is we have a whole bunch of members who are just like the gentlewoman that I'm going to extend time to in a minute, who come to the table as friends of the taxpayer, who come and look at bills and reauthorizations of legislation from a perspective of what is the government's role, what should be the government's role, and how do we engage with the American people to keep these programs not only to where they can sustain themselves, but also whether the taxpayers will be taken care of. And I'd like to yield to the gentlewoman from Shelby Township, Michigan. 3 minutes to the gentlewoman, Mrs. Miller.
Gentlelady is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I actually live in Harrison Township, and I appreciate that, though. But I certainly rise to support this rule, Mr. Speaker, but I am strongly, strongly opposed to the underlying bill, the National Flood Insurance Program. And I would start with this basic premise. Why in the world is the federal government even involved in the flood insurance business? Is that our core purpose of being the federal government? It's ridiculous. This program was started in 1968, and the government began writing policies in the early 70s, and no great surprise, the federal government is doing a lousy job of being in the insurance business. This program is currently over $17 billion in debt, and now we need to raise the debt ceiling on this program to about $25 billion. And recently, the FEMA administrator testified to Congress that the flood insurance program, no great surprise, is likely to stay in debt, massive debt, forever. And it's easy to understand why, because this program is not actuarially sound, and because the federal government can be treated apparently as a bottomless pit of money. So we don't need to base the premiums on any normal risk evaluation, which is a matrix that private sector insurance companies have to do. In fact, we actually encourage people to build in flood-prone areas that repeatedly flood. And just consider this one statistic. Only 1% of the properties in this program are considered to be repetitive losses, 1%. Yet that 1% account for 40% of the claims because they repeatedly flood and the federal government subsidizes them to reconstruct. And at a time of extreme financial distress for our nation, the federal government is subsidizing flood insurance. Why? If it's so great, why don't we start a fire insurance program? How about a wildfire insurance program? How about an earthquake protection program, insurance program? The truth is, Mr. Speaker, if we have a natural disaster in our country, this Congress, Americans, will always stand up and help that part of the country, that area of the country that is suffering. We will always help our fellow Americans. Well, this program may have been well-intentioned at the beginning, but it has evolved into something that is unrecognizable anymore. And if we ever truly want to downsize, to right-size government, the federal government, we just can't be nibbling around the edges of reforming a program that is ridiculous at its very core. We can't be reforming useless government programs. They need to be eliminated. And I believe that the National Flood Insurance Program is a waste of taxpayers' dollars. It is a boondoggle. It needs to be eradicated. So, Mr. Speaker, again, I do support the rule, but I obviously am very, very opposed to the National Flood Insurance Program. That is not the business of the federal government. We need to get out of that business. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts. Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my understanding then the gentleman is through with his speakers at this time. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman, the chairman of the Republican leadership team, the gentleman from Hood River, Oregon, Mr. Walden.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate the work of Mr. Sessions and the very powerful Rules Committee in bringing forward this rule, which I support. And I appreciate the work of our colleague from Illinois, Ms. Biggert, for introducing this legislation and working with me on some issues that are critically important to the people of eastern and southern Oregon, and frankly all across Oregon. Especially in places like Milton-Freewater, Oregon. In Milton-Freewater, citizens are paying hundreds of dollars more in flood insurance because FEMA came in and did a remap process, and it's put a real burden on the people of this community. The community's already set in motion a plan to fix the levees that FEMA says, you know, have fallen out of certification, to bring them back into compliance. This bill could provide relief from the mandatory insurance. Remember, you've got government sort of mandatory insurance hanging over these folks, while the community works to improve the levees. It also will force FEMA to factor in the actual protection afforded by existing levees regardless of their accreditation status. Part of the problem we have out there in Milton-Freewater is you got a couple of agencies fighting over whether there should be brush allowed to grow on the levees. One agency says, oh, we need that for shade in the river, and the other says, no, that actually degrades the integrity of the levee. So we have federal agencies fighting, and the people of Milton-Freewater get stuck with the bill. These common sense steps and others in the bill will provide the relief Milton-Freewater is in desperate need of. These changes will, according to one county commissioner from the area, benefit more than 2,000 people in the community. Now, down in southern Oregon, citizens in Jackson County have been adversely impacted by the recently redrawn FEMA flood maps that, as FEMA's admitted, used inferior mapping methods for some portions. Now, the new maps force many homeowners into 100- and 500-year floodplains for the first time. Now, that means they have to buy costly insurance when they may not even need it. It's not cheap either. While it runs about $400 a year for the 2-year discount period, premiums skyrocket after that to as much as $25,000 annually, I'm told. Now, this bill would waive that burdensome mandatory insurance purchase requirements while the new maps are being appealed by homeowners. The homeowners shouldn't get stuck with this bill, these extraordinary costs, when it may in fact be a mapping error that even the agency admits they used inferior methods on. This bill also improves the mapping process by reinstating the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, which will be better suited to take into account local factors during remapping, including natural topography and decertified levees that had not previously been considered. This bill works to bring the National Flood Insurance Program out of the red, while allowing communities more local input on their flood plans and time to adjust should they be designated as a high-risk area. So I urge my colleagues both to approve the rule and the underlying bill so that we may reauthorize the National Flood Insurance Program in a common-sense, fiscally responsible, and bipartisan way. And with that, I yield back to balance my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the gentleman from Hood River, Oregon, coming to speak not only about this bill, but also his strong leadership in issues that deal directly with our nation and to keep us physically sound. Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Lawrenceville, Georgia, one of my colleagues on the Rules Committee, the gentleman, Mr. Woodall.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Texas for yielding. You know, we do have the great pleasure of serving on the Rules Committee together. Though serving on the Rules Committee can be a benefit and a burden, because historically there's been kind of a gentleman's agreement, I would tell you, from what I've read about the institution, that if the Committee of Jurisdiction brings out a clever idea, they only bring out those clever ideas that they really like. And then the leadership of the House, whichever party's in control of the House, then only allows those reported bills that they really like to show up here on the floor of the House for us to debate. So then when the Rules Committee gets around to considering amendments, well, maybe the only amendments that are allowed are things that nibble around the edges but don't really make any substantive changes to the underlying bill. 5 months, now 6 now. I've been here in the U.S. House of Representatives as part of this freshman class. And what we're doing today excites me. It excites me. And the folks who have been here a little bit longer, maybe it's not as exciting to you as it is to me, but what is happening here today, not only did we get a bill that went through the regular order process, coming out of committee, no special games played, went through the amendment process in committee. Everybody got a vote. In fact, was reported unanimously out of committee, as I understand. Then it came to the Rules Committee. We had about 30 amendments offered up at the Rules Committee. A couple weren't germane, a couple were duplicative, but everything else we allowed. And one of those amendments was an amendment that said, this is just a dumb program, let's scrap it, send it to the states and start over again. Wow. Wow. Now, there are a lot of amendments that we allowed that said, well, let's, change a 6 to a 5, or let's change this number of members to this number of members, things that would improve a bill, nibble around the edges. But this rule today, for the first time that I can recall, allows an amendment that says the entire underlying legislation is headed in the wrong direction, let's take a new direction. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are folks who would be scared about that kind of amendment. Folks who would be intimidated to let something come to the floor. We have absolutely no idea what's going to happen, but this House has made a new commitment, a renewed commitment, to expressing the voice of the American people. And guess what? The only amendments that are going to pass on the floor today are ones the American people are behind. The only amendments that are going to pass on the floor today are ones that get 218 votes and represent the majority will of this U.S. House of Representatives. It just makes me so proud. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, for folks who don't follow the process as closely as you and I do, that they will see what a difference that is. And it's a difference from administrations going back 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. Folks say if it's an idea that has the support of the House, that it deserves to be heard, and we're going to hear all of those amendments here on the floor today. Mr. Speaker, it's not easy to maintain that level of openness in the House. It takes a lot of cooperation between both sides of the aisle to make openness work. We've had that cooperation, and I don't mean cooperation in the sense that folks agree on absolutely all the ideas. I mean cooperation in the sense that folks know that when the House works its will, the people's work gets done. When the House works its will, the American people's voice is best heard. And I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their commitment to making that work, and I thank my friend from Texas for yielding me the time this morning. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I want to advise my colleague, the gentleman, Mr. McGovern, that we do not have any further speakers at this time, and would wish to defer to his judgment on closing.
Mr. Speaker, I will yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me first of all say that I'm glad that the gentleman from Georgia is excited. I'm not quite at that level. I'm okay, but I'm not excited. This is not an open rule. We had an opportunity to have an open rule. We called for a vote. Unfortunately, my friends on the other side of the aisle voted against it. But having said that, there are a lot of different amendments in here that represent a lot of different viewpoints, and so I'm okay with it. So I will begin by saying that. Secondly, I want to say to my colleagues that this is a good bill. It is not a boondoggle, as the gentlewoman from Michigan referred to it. It is a necessary protection for people. The question was asked, well, why should the government be involved in flood insurance? Well, one of the reasons why is because the private insurance industry has no interest in providing the kind of coverage at an affordable level to people who need it. If there was money to be made, if they thought they could make money, you could bet the private insurance industry would step up, and try to fill in the void. But they haven't, and they won't. And so without this, you will end up dealing with these catastrophes with disaster relief funds that Congress would have to approve, and that's not a very efficient or good way to deal with the issue of floods. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to point out that this is an important bill, not only because it is bipartisan in nature, but I think there's also a bipartisan consensus that it is important that we move forward with this. Again, I want to commend Mrs. Biggert and the members of the Financial Services Committee. I want to commend Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who worked together in a bipartisan way, who produced a bill that passed 54-0. You don't see that very much. And this has been a very contentious Congress, and there have been lots of partisan divides when it has come to voting on bills. But in this one area, there is consensus, which I think is an indication that it will win broad bipartisan support in this Congress. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Texas for bringing this rule to the floor. I want to thank all those who are responsible for the underlying bill and look forward to supporting it. And I hope my colleagues on a bipartisan level will support my amendment, which I think is a good amendment. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Massachusetts not only for his service to the Rules Committee, but also to the ideas that he represents. And I'm delighted that he had an opportunity today to state with great clarity that the 25 amendments that have been made in order by the Rules Committee is good for this institution, this body, and lives up to the promise not just that our Speaker, the gentleman John Boehner, and our Majority Leader Eric Cantor subscribed to, but also the Chairman of the Rules Committee, the gentleman David Dreyer. Mr. Speaker, the bill we are discussing today provides a long-term certainty in the flood insurance market, allows for greater transparency and accountability in the flood insurance program, and removes or diminishes greatly the great risk that taxpayers incur from bailing out the current program. This country is facing a $14 trillion debt, with almost $18 billion of that coming from the NFIP. Congress sorely needed to retain its control over this program and to ensure that we re-looked at it in its reauthorization. However, we still have a government that spends way too much, taxes too much, listens too little to the needs of the American people. And today, the Republican Party, through the leadership that we're being provided by Mrs. Biggert from Illinois, is doing exactly that, one at a time, to take on the programs and needs of this great nation. Once again, this bill provides us much-needed long-term reauthorization and amends the NFIP to ensure the immediate and near-term physical and administrative health of this program. The bill also ensures that the NFIP continued viability by encouraging broader participation in the program, increasing financial accountability, eliminating unnecessary rate subsidies, and updating the program to meet the needs, the current needs of this great nation. I applaud my colleagues for introducing the bill, the gentlewoman, Mrs. Biggert, for her hard work, the hundreds of meetings that were involved, taking feedback from members of Congress, looking at their needs, and then addressing those. I encourage a yes vote on this rule, and I move the previous questions on the resolution.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Speaker?
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Can I ask for a roll call on this vote?
Yeas and nays.
Yes, ask for the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those in favor vote yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 for the proceedings on this question will be postponed.
Who's the manager on this one?
Dan. And it's Polis from...
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, by the Direction and Rules Committee, I call up House Resolution 337 and ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 50, House Resolution 337, resolved that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 2354, making appropriations for energy and water development and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. Points of order against provisions in the bill for failure to comply with Clause 2 of Rule 21 are waived. During consideration of the bill for amendment, the chair of the Committee of the Whole may accord priority and recognition on the basis of whether the member offering an amendment has caused it to be printed in the portion of the congressional record designated for that purpose in Clause 8 of Rule 18. Amendments so printed shall be considered as read. When the committee rises and reports the bill back to the House with a recommendation that the bill do pass, the previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage, without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions.